We might have time for a question or two. Yes, sir.
Melissa, I just wondered if there's something missing from your program. I'm not opposed to what you've given us, but I just wonder whether there's something else missing, which is suggested by the panel of Lorraine and Daphne just a short while ago. Because what they suggested to me, and maybe I was internalizing their message too deeply, that this is a struggle in part, maybe large part, over what it is to be a judge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That it is a kind of what's the background norm or premise is what they're fighting over is, to use Lorraine's phrase again, is a kind of trying to empty from the judicial function normativity. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's wrong with learning from abroad is there's nothing to learn about. You know, that is, the judge's function is not someone that needs to be educated, but merely to look at the words of the text or the original history, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Now, what's disturbing to me from the moderates is that they capitulate to that view. I mean, the most disturbing thing about these, I haven't watched all these judicial confirmation proceedings, is this kind of ridiculous posture of Sotomayor, you know, that I'm simply, you know, a judge.
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
You know, almost a repeat of Roberts. And I mean, I don't know exactly what the line was with the king, but it's also a capitulation to that. Yeah. And it seems to me that a militant moderate must not only do what you suggest, but the militant moderate, and that's the failure of the moderate, is to challenge that conception of what judging is.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. And just to clarify, Owen, I don't think that the militant moderate position that I'm advocating is the same thing as what Sotomayor did in her confirmation hearing, right? And I know you're not saying it is either. I agree with you that the
American people have to be educated to what judging is.
And what judging has always been in this country, right? But here I think is what's confusing things. I think that the controversy over should we look to outside sources, it's such an emotional issue for folks. They get so upset about it that it's very easy, I think, for folks to latch onto that, and then that also colors their views about things like, judicial activism and what's it mean to be a judge. You see what I'm saying? And so because they get so enraged by cases like Roper versus Simmons and the international and the outsider coming in, I think it makes it very difficult for us to then say, but wait a minute, judging is not this sort of narrow profession where you're simply applying the law. There's this moral component to it. There's this, my father was a judge. I very strongly, passionately believe in these things. I guess what I'm arguing is if we can't find more nuanced ways to make the arguments about why international law or foreign authority is important to judges, and when it's important and when it's not important, and how that can fit in with the very strong sort of feeling that folks have that we don't want to, we want our judges to be independent and we don't want them to simply be sort of these passive recipients. If we can't make those arguments in very strong ways, I think we are also going to find that we lose the battle on the concerns that you have, right? That we lose the battle on what does it mean to be a judge? Is it this narrow conception or is it a broader one?
Professor Levins.
This is the first time today that I disagreed with I think what you're doing is setting up a contrast between, and I apologize to Lorraine for using her a universalist and a Scalian positivist. But if you look at Ronald Dworkin, who is scarcely a Scalian, Dworkin is not a universalist and says that there are local moralities And so, for example, with regard to an issue that I think is of interest to both of us, the welfare state, Dworkin threw Frank Michelman over the sled and said that, you know, it would be desirable if we had a constitutionalized welfare state, but we don't. So that a proper American judge would have to recognize that American morality is really quite different from, say, the social democratic morality of some of the European countries. And I think that's a powerful argument. The second point I'd make is that for a number of years, we have assumed that international law is progressive. But Kim Shepley, in particular, has been doing some really very troublesome writing on how the immediate consequence to September 11th was for the United Nations to pass some resolutions that required every country to get tough on terrorists. And with regard to what we're talking about this morning, the Obama administration is justifying going to war in Libya, not on the basis of anything plausibly within the United States Constitution as traditionally understood, but because our adherence to the United Nations treaty system transforms the way we go to war. Now, you know, it seems to me, maybe that's right. Maybe that's what it ought to be, but this is a circumstance where you can't necessarily tell who the good guys and bad guys are as between the localists and the internationalists.
Let me is inconsistent with learning.
No.
Well, I'm sorry. I've just got to get in here. So just one thing on Roper. Just to bring this back around to Roper versus Simmons, though. Here's what I think the problem is. So I agree with you, Owen. I think it's so important that we. I don't think we need to educate people on this. I think we need to remind people that judges, there's this learning function, right, and that judges can look to the outside world for sort of. For help in sort of articulating their own moral views on particular issues. I personally think that a lot of this political backlash is that Justice Kennedy in Roper versus Simmons was not doing that. So if he had actually been looking to the rest of the world and saying, gee, let's look to what foreign courts have actually said on why we should abolish the juvenile death penalty, or let's look to what foreigners have actually said on why we shouldn't execute juveniles, then that's the sort of learning that you're looking for. And I think that's the sort of role, expansive role that we typically think that judges should have. What he did instead was he cited some treaties, right? He cited one that, my gosh, I mean, we hadn't even ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Don't cite that treaty. That's a terrible idea if you don't want a political backlash, right? He cited the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we only ratified with a specific reservation that said we don't recognize the juvenile death penalty provision in this treaty, right? And he did all this as this sort of shorthand way of saying, oh, well, look, the rest of the world agrees with the position I happen to want to take, or at least that's the way it came out. So there was no real learning there. There was simply... one argument you could make is he had a weak argument on national consensus because fewer than half of the states in the United States had actually abolished the juvenile death penalty, and he decided to shore that up with this incredibly strong international consensus abolishing the death penalty. So I think that's part of the problem. I think that's
Melissa, that should be the position of the militant moderate.
Yes, I agree.
I will let Professor Wagner make one concluding remark, and then we'll go on and let Justice Brock
I'm slightly baffled, right? And by one thing, I know that I have to sell myself or sell my ideas for my tenure purposes, but I'm less convinced that I have to, and this is sort of, we don't have time to debate this, but I'm less convinced that I really have to that I would have to sell my ideas in that way that you described it, right? I still have sort of maybe an idealistic notion that arguments convince, which is, however, much harder to do in a polity, and this is sort of an observation in the country I live in right now, of very entrenched politics. And I think this is what Owen Fisk was alluding to, is sort of, how do you convince the other side, and what type of engagement do you need to have? The other thing, though, that struck me in this just very short exchange is, again, seeing this through the lens of liberals versus conservative, again, right, which strikes me as not necessarily helpful all the time, because I think I would disagree with Sandy Levinson on the last part. I generally think that international law is conservative, But I don't think that necessarily the notion of humanitarian intervention is very conservative, quite the contrary. And therefore, I don't think that that really fits that mold very well overall. But I think that, and I just overall don't know that that sort of, I realize that that's where we need to maybe pick up some people, but I don't know that that's the sole place that discourse needs to take place at. And that's sort of, maybe potentially concluding observation before President Barack, I think.
Well, thank you, Professor Wagner. Thank you, Professor Waters.
Thank you.
Thank you for the kind words, Professor Waters.